Everyone has heard about Lake Mead, the falling reservoir, the bleached bathtub ring on the canyon walls, the dramatic images of a great lake shrinking in the desert have made it the face of the American water crisis. It is visible, photogenic, easy to understand, a body of water you can see with your own eyes as it drops lower and lower. But there is another water crisis unfolding across the middle of the country that is far larger, far more consequential, and almost completely invisible, and it is happening beneath the ground where no camera can capture it. It is the depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest underground stores of fresh water in the world, and here is a fact that should stop you cold. In a single year, the Ogallala can lose more water than the entire Lake Mead reservoir holds. The crisis you cannot see is bigger than the one you can. Let that comparison sink in, because it reframes everything about how we think about water in America. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the country, the great symbol of the water crisis, holds an enormous quantity of water when full. And the Ogallala Aquifer, in the course of a single year of heavy pumping and inadequate recharge, can lose a volume of water that rivals or exceeds that entire reservoir. Year after year, this vast underground reserve gives up an amount of water comparable to draining one of the largest reservoirs in the nation, and it does so silently, invisibly, without the dramatic images that would make the loss impossible to ignore. The Ogallala is being emptied on a scale that dwarfs the visible crisis of the reservoirs, and yet because it happens underground, out of sight, it commands only a fraction of the attention. To understand the magnitude of what is being lost, you have to understand what the Ogallala Aquifer is. It is an immense body of water held underground beneath the Great Plains, stretching across a huge swath of the central United States, underlying parts of many states in the heart of the country. It is not an underground lake or river in the way people sometimes imagine, but rather water held within the pores and spaces of a vast layer of sand, gravel, and rock beneath the surface. A saturated zone that holds an almost unimaginable quantity of fresh water. This water is the foundation of one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet, the source that irrigates the fields of the Great Plains and makes possible the enormous production of crops and livestock that feeds much of the nation and beyond. The Ogallala is, in a very real sense, the hidden reservoir beneath the breadbasket of America, and here is what makes its depletion so tragic and so alarming. Much of the water in the Ogallala is ancient, accumulated over an immense span of time, tens of thousands of years or more, deposited slowly across the ages as water seeped down into the ground. In much of the aquifer, this water is not being meaningfully replenished on any human timescale, because the rate at which new water soaks down to recharge the aquifer is extremely slow, far slower than the rate at which the water is being pumped out. This means that when the water is withdrawn, it is, for all practical purposes, gone for good, not to be replaced within any span of time that matters to human beings. The Ogallala is being mined, its ancient water extracted and used up, drawn from a reserve that took ages to fill and that will not refill once it is emptied. This is not like a reservoir that can be refilled by the next wet year. It is the permanent removal of a resource that cannot be recovered. Why is so much water being taken from the aquifer? The answer is agriculture, the vast irrigation that has transformed the Great Plains into one of the most productive farming regions in the world. The region above the Ogallala is, by nature, relatively dry, a place where rainfall alone is often not enough for intensive agriculture. But beneath the surface lay this enormous reserve of water, and when the technology arrived to pump it up in great quantities and spread it across the fields, it unleashed an agricultural revolution. The dry plains bloomed with irrigated crops, the farms multiplied and expanded, and the region became a powerhouse of production, growing vast quantities of grain and other crops, and supporting enormous numbers of livestock. All of this bounty rests on the water pumped from the Ogallala, and it is the enormous and sustained withdrawal of that water for irrigation that is draining the aquifer at such an alarming rate. The scale of the pumping is staggering, and it far exceeds the aquifer's ability to recharge, which is why the water levels are falling and the reserve is being depleted. Across much of the region, the water is being withdrawn far faster then nature replaces it, so that the level of water in the aquifer drops steadily, year after year, as the reserve is drawn down. In some areas, the decline has been dramatic, the water table falling by a great distance over the decades of intensive pumping, and in the most heavily used areas, portions of the aquifer have already been substantially depleted, the water that was once there now gone. The comparison to Lake Mead captures the scale of a single year's loss, but that loss is repeated year after year. An ongoing drainage of a finite and irreplaceable resource, steadily emptying one of the greatest stores of fresh water on Earth. What makes this crisis so insidious is precisely its invisibility. When a reservoir like Lake Mead falls, everyone can see it. The shrinking water, the exposed shorelines, the dramatic decline are visible to anyone who looks. And the images command attention and concern. But when an aquifer is depleted, there is nothing to see. The water is underground, hidden from view, and its loss is invisible on the surface. A farmer may notice that the wells must be drilled deeper, that the pumps must work harder, that the water is harder to reach than it used to be. But the general public sees nothing. No shrinking lake. No bathtub ring, no dramatic images. The land above the aquifer looks the same whether the water beneath it is full or nearly gone. This invisibility means that the depletion of the Ogallala, despite its enormous scale, has never captured the public imagination the way the visible reservoir crisis has, and so it has received far less attention than its magnitude deserves. The consequences of this depletion, however, are anything but invisible, because they threaten the foundation of a vast agricultural economy and the food production that depends on it. As the aquifer is drained, the water becomes harder and more expensive to reach, requiring deeper wells and more powerful pumps and more energy to lift it to the surface. Eventually, in the most depleted areas, the water becomes so difficult or so costly to extract that irrigation is no longer economically viable, and the land must revert from irrigated farming to dryland farming or be taken out of production altogether. This transition, from the lush productivity of irrigated agriculture back to the limited yields possible with rainfall alone, represents an enormous loss, both for the farmers and communities of the region and for the food supply that depends on their production. The draining of the Ogallala is in effect the slow undermining of the agricultural foundation of a huge and vital region. The human dimension of this crisis is profound, because entire communities and ways of life have been built on the water of the aquifer, and they face an uncertain and precarious future as the water declines. The towns and farms of the region grew and prospered on the strength of the irrigated agriculture that the Ogallala made possible, and their economies, their populations. And their very existence depend on the continued availability of the water. As the aquifer is depleted and the irrigation becomes unsustainable, these communities face the prospect of decline, of shrinking economies and populations, of a way of life that may not survive the exhaustion of the water on which it was built. The depletion of the Ogallala is not just an environmental or agricultural problem, but a human one, threatening the livelihoods and the futures of the people who live above the vanishing water. It is important to understand that the depletion is not uniform across the vast expanse of the aquifer, because the Ogallala is not a single uniform pool, but a sprawling formation that varies greatly from place to place. In some regions, the water-bearing layer is thick and deep, holding a great quantity of water that can sustain pumping for a long time even at high rates. In others, the layer is thin, holding far less, and in these places the depletion can proceed rapidly, the water exhausted in a matter of decades or even less under heavy pumping. The rate of recharge also varies, with some areas receiving a bit more replenishment from rainfall and others almost none. The result is a patchwork, in which some areas remain relatively rich in water, while others have already been drawn down to the point where irrigation is failing. This unevenness means that the crisis arrives at different times in different places, striking some communities hard while others still have water to spare, but the overall trajectory across the aquifer is one of decline. The reserve steadily diminishing region by region. The stakes of this decline reach far beyond the borders of the Great Plains, because the agriculture that the Ogallala sustains feeds a vast number of people well beyond the region itself. The crops grown with the aquifer's water, and the livestock raised on those crops flow into the food supply of the entire nation and beyond, making the region one of the great engines of food production on the planet. When the water that underpins this production declines, the effects ripple outward through the food system, potentially affecting the availability and the price of food far from the plains where the water is pumped. The depletion of the Ogallala is thus not a local concern confined to the farmers and towns above it, but a matter of national and even global significance, a slow erosion of one of the foundations of the world's food supply, unfolding silently beneath the surface of the land. There is a deep irony and a hard lesson in the story of the Ogallala, because the very abundance of the aquifer, the enormous quantity of water it held, encouraged the pattern of use that is now draining it. When the water seemed limitless, when there was so much of it beneath the ground, there was little incentive to conserve, little reason to worry about running out. The vast reserve created a sense of endless supply, and the region built an entire agricultural economy on the assumption that the water would always be there. But the water was never truly limitless, and the ancient reserve, however vast, could not withstand the relentless withdrawal indefinitely. The abundance that seemed to guarantee the region's future was in fact a finite inheritance being spent down, and the sense of limitless supply led to a pattern of use that is now exhausting it. This is a recurring theme in the story of water and of resources generally, the way that abundance can breed the very overuse that destroys it. What makes the Ogallala situation especially sobering is the permanence of the loss, the fact that in much of the aquifer, the water that is being used up will not come back. A reservoir like Lake Mead, however low it falls, can in principle be refilled by a return of wetter conditions, by years of abundant flow that replenish the reserve. The crisis of the reservoirs, dire as it is at least potentially reversible if the conditions change. But the depletion of the Ogallala, in the areas where the recharge is negligible, is effectively permanent on any human timescale. The ancient water, once pumped out, is gone for tens of thousands of years or more, and no change in the weather, no return of wet conditions, will bring it back within any span of time that matters. This permanence gives the Ogallala crisis a finality that the reservoir crisis lacks, a sense that what is being lost is truly and irretrievably gone. Is there anything that can be done? The situation is serious, but it is not entirely without hope, because the rate of depletion can be slowed and the life of the aquifer can be extended through changes in how the water is used. The most fundamental response is to reduce the withdrawals, to pump less water from the aquifer, bringing the rate of extraction closer to the slow rate of recharge and slowing the decline. This can be achieved through more efficient irrigation methods that deliver water more precisely to the crops and reduce the enormous losses to evaporation and runoff. Through shifts to crops that require less water, and through choices to reduce the total amount of irrigated land. Where such measures are adopted, the depletion can be slowed, the water made to last longer, buying time for the region and its communities. The choices that the farmers and communities of the region make about how to use their remaining water will determine how long the aquifer lasts and how gradual or abrupt the transition away from irrigation will be. But these responses face real obstacles because reducing water use means reducing the agricultural production that the region's economy depends on, imposing real costs on the farmers and communities in the present in order to preserve the water for the future. There is a fundamental tension between the immediate interest in using the water to grow crops and make a living now, and the longer-term interest in conserving the water to extend the life of the aquifer. For an individual farmer, the incentive is often to use the water while it is available, because the water not used today may simply be pumped by a neighbor tomorrow, and the benefits of conservation are shared and deferred while the costs are immediate and personal. This dynamic, in which individual incentives push toward continued use even as the collective interest calls for conservation, is one of the deepest challenges in managing the aquifer, and it helps explain why the depletion has continued despite the awareness of its dangers. The story of the Ogallala Aquifer carries a lesson that extends far beyond the Great Plains, because it is a particularly stark example of a pattern that recurs wherever human beings draw on a finite reserve of a vital resource faster than it can be replenished. The aquifer is a bank account of ancient water, filled over the ages and now being spent down, and once it is emptied, it cannot be refilled. The way the region has drawn on this reserve, treating a finite and irreplaceable resource as though it were an endless supply, is a cautionary tale about the danger of building a way of life on the consumption of a resource that cannot last. As populations grow and demands on water increase around the world, the lesson of the Ogallala, of the invisible reserve being silently drained beneath the breadbasket of a nation, is one that many regions may come to learn, a warning about the limits of the resources on which our prosperity depends. The comparison that began this story, the fact that the Ogallala can lose more water in a single year than Lake Mead holds, is ultimately a way of making the invisible visible, of conveying the true scale of a crisis that unfolds out of sight. We fixate on the reservoirs because we can see them, because their decline is dramatic and photogenic. But the far larger loss is happening beneath our feet, in the silent draining of the great aquifer. To grasp that the underground crisis dwarfs the visible one is to understand that our attention has been drawn to the smaller emergency, while the larger one proceeds largely unremarked. The Ogallala is being emptied on a scale that should command national concern. And yet, because it happens underground, it remains a crisis in the shadows, a slow-motion catastrophe, unfolding where no one can see it. In the end, the depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer is one of the most important and least appreciated environmental and economic challenges facing the country. A crisis whose scale is captured by the staggering comparison to Lake Mead, but whose true significance lies in what it means for the future of a vast agricultural region and the food it produces. The ancient water that made the Great Plains bloom is being used up, silently and permanently, and the region faces a reckoning with the limits of a resource it has long treated as endless. Whether the depletion can be slowed enough to preserve the aquifer for future generations, whether the communities of the region can find a way to sustain themselves as the water declines, whether the nation will awaken to the magnitude of this invisible crisis before it is too late, remains to be seen. But the fact that the Ogallala loses more water in a year than the great symbol of the water crisis holds should be a wake-up call, a reminder that the most consequential losses are not always the ones we can see, and that beneath the surface of the land, a treasure accumulated over the ages is quietly draining away, with consequences